Welcome back to Barefoot Farm. If you're new, I'm Brittany, and today we're going to be making cinnamon raisin swirl sourdough bread. It is delicious, and I hope you give it a try. So come on, let's get in the kitchen and start baking. Now we have to prepare our raisins for our sourdough. What we don't want to happen is for our dried raisins to absorb all of the moisture from the dough. So what I'm doing is, before I start preparing my dough, I'm going to hydrate my raisins in some boiling water. Here I have a 1/3 cup of raisins, and what I'll do is add enough boiling water to cover the raisins, and I'm going to give it a good stir so that any that are clumped together will get loose. And then I'm going to lightly cover that bowl to keep any of the moisture in there, and set it aside for 30 minutes to an hour. To get started, I had fed my starter earlier today and let it do its rise for about 3 hours, and as you can see, it's more than doubled in size, so I know it's ready to make bread. Now we'll drain our raisins that have been plumping for about 30 minutes, and we want to get as much of the water off as possible. And then what we're going to do is add some flour to a bowl and add our raisins so that they're fully coated with flour so that they don't clump up together in the mix. To my bowl, I've added about 1 cup of active starter, and then I will add 1 1/3 cups of filtered water and 2 teaspoons of salt, and then I will give it a good stir before we add our flour. Now I'll begin adding 3 cups of all-purpose flour. Depending on the humidity that day when you're making your bread, you may need to add more flour. It just depends on the final texture that you're feeling for. I decided to go ahead and add about another 1/2 cup of flour to my dough because it was still softer than I'd like. Once you get to doing sourdough many times, you'll get to know what the right consistency of your dough is. But I wanted to make sure that my dough was a little more on the drier side, since I did have those hydrated raisins in there, and I didn't want to risk it becoming very watery. At this point, I wanted to use my dough scraper to really get in and start some folds going on. It really helps to kind of pull your dough together without having to get your hands all sticky. So if you haven't gotten a dough scraper yet, it's one of my favorite and most necessary tools when making sourdough. I'll have all of the tools I use today linked below in the description. Now that my dough is all ready to go, I'm going to cover my bowl and set the dough in an oven with just the light bulb on for 30 minutes, and then we'll start our first of 3 sets of stretches and folds. So it's been 30 minutes, and what I'm going to do is wet my hand. This is the best way to do stretches and folds without your hands getting sticky. So you're going to want to pull up one side of the dough and stretch it as far as you can and lay it over, and turn your bowl a quarter way and pull the dough up and fold it over again, and keep doing that, 5 or 6 times. And then you cover your dough back up and put it back in the oven for 30 more minutes and do this process again. And we'll do this for a total of 3 times before we do the 2-hour bulk ferment. Here we are with our second set of stretches and folds, and you'll notice that your dough is going to start having a different texture each time you do it, because what these stretches and folds are doing is building strength in the gluten in your dough, and it's very important to do these so that you get the best rise in your dough. And this would be the third and final set of stretches and folds. And after we're done doing this, we're going to once again cover our bowl, put the bowl back in the oven with the light on, and we're going to let it do its bulk ferment. And this can take 2 to 3 hours. It just depends on the temperature in the oven and in your home. And what we're looking for at the end, and I'll show you in the next segment, what we're looking for in the end after the bulk ferment is that our dough is very jiggly. That means that there's been a lot of air produced from the fermented sourdough starter, and it means it's ready to bake. So our sourdough is almost ready and finished with its bulk ferment. So before I get started putting everything together, I want to prepare the cinnamon sugar mix that'll go in the cinnamon swirl part of the bread. So what I've done here is I have a 1/2 cup of brown sugar, and then I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of ground cinnamon. And I'm also going to add about a tablespoon of flour. And when you add sugar to sourdough, it tends to turn your sourdough watery. So by adding the flour, that will help stop the need for the sourdough to turn watery. That flour will help absorb some of the water that will be produced by the sugar. So we're going to go ahead and put these ingredients together, give them a good stir, and set aside for putting together our bread. So my dough has been bulk fermenting for about 3 hours at this point. It has doubled in size, and as you can tell, it's very jiggly, and so I know that it's ready to be made into bread. Now I'm going to liberally flour my work surface so that the dough will not stick. It's going to be very sticky at this point, so flour is your friend. I also make sure to add some flour to my banneton, and as you'll see later, I should have added more flour at this point. Always go with more flour whenever you're making any kind of sourdough that has sugar or any kind of add-ins that contain sugar, because they'll need that extra flour. So now I'm going to pour my dough out onto the surface, and we'll start doing lamination, which is shaping the dough, pulling it, outwards and shaping the dough into a large rectangular shape so that we can add our cinnamon sugar and also some extra raisins. Flouring your hands during lamination is going to be very helpful, so don't be shy using flour when you need it. You just don't want to get any flour on that top surface, because when we are done with this lamination and we fold over our dough, we'll need it to be sticky so that the dough can stick to itself and create a seal. So now I'm just pulling the dough outwards, trying to get under it from the middle and pull out to have a result of a large rectangular shape. Now I'm going to add about 3/4 of my cinnamon sugar mix down the middle, making sure to leave a border all the way around the rectangle so that none of the cinnamon sugar gets outside of that border. We want to make sure to keep it in, and then go ahead and spread it out and press it in so that the cinnamon sugar mix will adhere to the dough. And at this point, I'm going to add a couple of raisins that were not hydrated. It'll just help add some extra texture and hopefully pull out, like I said, some of that moisture that the sugar is going to produce. Now I'm going to pull one side of the dough over, and the other side will meet it in the middle, and then we're going to make sure to pinch the seam very well so that it has a great seal, so that none of those cinnamon sugar or raisins will ooze out during the baking process. And once we have that seal done, we're going to add the remainder of the cinnamon sugar mix down the middle, and this is going to help create a really nice swirl whenever you cut your bread open. Now I'm going to make sure to pinch any tears that are in the dough before I start rolling. So here you'll see I'm rolling and pulling so that we could create a tight roll with the dough. And typically with sourdough, once you do this, you do a bunch of turns and pulling to create a taut, smooth surface. But with this, it's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to go ahead and seal that edge, and then I'm going to be very careful to do my pulls on it to create the surface, because with the raisins in, see, I'm tucking the sides in and just doing a slight pull, adding some flour on top, because those raisins, as the inclusions in this dough, it's very easy for them to pop out and create an opening, and we don't want that to happen. So this is a very delicate dough, so be very cognizant of that and just be very gentle with it. Now we're going to flip it over top side down in our banneton, once again making sure to seal any of the openings that we have here. And then we're going to cover this dough, cover the banneton. I use some saran wrap over the top and then put the bonnet on top of it. And then it's going to go in the refrigerator to do a cold ferment overnight. And then we'll bake it first thing in the morning. So it's now the next morning, and I preheated my oven to 500 degrees with the cast iron Dutch oven from cold to 500. So now I'm preparing my parchment paper that my dough will go on. So what I'm going to do now is flour the top of the dough here, because that will be the bottom and I don't want it to stick to the parchment. Especially, like I said, it has the cinnamon sugar mix, so the odds of that oozing out is very high. So I'm just taking the precaution here. So once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and flip over my my banneton to release the dough. And as you'll see, I have some complications. I've realized that the dough is stuck at some point of on the bottom of the banneton, so I am able to pry it loose a little bit and get it out, and it's resulted in a tear in my dough. But it's all good. I went ahead and I sealed up the tear as best as I could, and all is not lost on this bread. And even though there's a tear in this bread, I'm going to go ahead and get out my lom and do, make an incision, make a cut into the dough so that it will have an area to, release steam so that it won't tear the dough. And it's, going to help create that ear that everybody's looking for on their sourdough loaf. Now the bread is ready to go in the oven, so I'm pulling out my hot Dutch oven, and I will place the dough in and put the lid back on. So for the first part of the bake, we'll put it back in the oven. We'll reduce the temperature to 485 degrees, and it will cook for approximately 25 minutes with the lid on. Now that the first bake has ended, we're going to go ahead and remove the lid from the Dutch oven and let the bread go once more for 15 minutes at this point and reduce the temperature down to 450. But look how nice it looks so far. It's so pretty and it smells incredible. Look, this is glorious, and it tastes even better than glorious. So it finished its 15-minute bake at 450, and so now I'm going to temp it, because whenever you're making sourdough, you want the internal temperature to be between 200 and 210 to ensure that it's fully cooked and not gummy on the inside. So we're sitting right at about 200 on this loaf, and so I know it's done. Now you'll want to immediately remove it from the Dutch oven and put it on a wire rack to rest for at least 30 minutes before cutting. The hardest part is the waiting. So it's been a little over 30 minutes and I can't wait any longer. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this open. And it's always a surprise and gratifying when the inside of your loaf looks picture perfect and just like you were hoping for. And take a look. It looks beautiful. Look at those swirls. I am so excited to give it a try. So now I'm going to cut off a little bit of the heel and butter it up and see how it is. This is divine. You gotta give it a try. It's delicious. It stuck to my Banneton, but we saved it. Thank goodness.